Today's interview is with John R. Wood, who is the media director of Better Angels Project, which is a project that is attempting to decrease the amount of polarity in United States public discourse. He also ran for United States Congress in California in 2014. And in this interview, we talk about how he got into politics and how jazz music informs how he speaks to people who have different views than him. What sparked your interest in politics, and then what pushed you into actually putting your name in the ring?
Right. So there is a fair amount of backstory to that. I grew up a person who was always very much interested in politics, and I guess that it's something of a family legacy on some level. I grew up in a very left-leaning environment. I grew up in Culver City, California, and going to the Culver City School District, which it turns out is, I think, the fourth most diverse school district in America, or what have you. So you can imagine that it was a generically progressive sort of environment, and my family was, mostly Democrats. My grandfather was acquaintance of John F. Kennedy's and was very much a Kennedy Democrat. Grandpa was a big figure in the record industry. He was the founder of the Randy's Record Shop and Dot Records thereafter, which was Pat Boone's record label, and Lawrence Welk and Billy Vaughn, Gail Storm, all sorts of folks. And so Grandpa and Granny were delegates to Kennedy's nominating convention in 1960. So there's a little bit of a family heritage in that. And as a kid, I just very naturally just always sort of gravitated towards politics as an area of interest. I remember being 5 or 6 years old and just running to the TV screen every time George Bush Sr. would it's so dorky for me to say this, but every time George Bush Sr. would give a press conference. And at the time, I just remember thinking, without any great appreciation for our system of government, I just thought, like, President of the United States, he must be like the King of America or something. Anything he says has got to be pretty important.
Yeah.
So, I was always interested in politics generically, and there were a few events which sort of woke me up to the idea that the liberal side of the conversation was both the reasonable and the rational and the humanistic side of the conversation, and so I operated on that assumption for most of my life, and wound up really. I was something of an activist in high school, opposing the Iraq War, going out handing out bumper stickers for Al Gore's campaign prior to that, and was really sort of disillusioned with politics after George W. Bush was reelected.
Yeah.
And after that, I probably would have stayed disillusioned if it weren't for Barack Obama's ascendance on the national stage. And I was one of those people who was extremely inspired by Barack Obama's campaign. It seemed to resonate with the idealism, in my mind, it seemed to resonate with the idealism of Martin Luther King Jr., which said that, Obama, in saying that we don't live in a red America or a blue America, or rather a Latino or Asian or a white America, but rather this is the United States of America, that seemed to ring harmoniously with King's dream that one day little black boys and little white boys and black girls and white girls could sit together at the table of brotherhood, and that we'd be judged by the content of our character and not by the color of our skin. And so Obama's appearance on the political stage, to me, it seemed like the culmination of Camelot, right? The idea that people, the expectation that people had of the Kennedy era, that it would be this time of sort of idealistic political and cultural reconciliation. So I threw myself into that with wholehearted, reckless abandon, I guess. But I never looked at the idea of fundamentally changing America as meaning socializing America exactly. And that's the way a lot of folks on the right took it. To me, that meant creating a post-racial, post-partisan society as much as possible. Again, I was generically left-wing. But to be an instrument of that kind of renaissance, I thought the most important thing I could do would be to communicate more with Republicans and conservatives and so forth. So, around this time of my life, and I'm about, let's see, I would have been about 20, 21. I had just gotten married. My wife had joined the military. We moved to Colorado Springs, which was a military town. I was sort of in the midst of something of a spiritual and a religious conversion, which was probably also played a role in all of this.
Into what faith, if you mind me asking?
Well, my journey sort of went from agnosticism to New Age spirituality to Christianity, albeit, the label Christian carries with it, obviously a wide range of differing schools of thought and theological interpretation and various levels of scientific compatibility or incompatibility. So, but just suffice it to say that I came to see myself as a Christian as I got through, this period of transformation, and that has a lot to do with informing a lot of my ethical philosophy, you might say. But nevertheless, the one thing I did very conscientiously was I went out of my way to start reading books that I hadn't read before that would shine a light on the conservative viewpoint. So, I started reading things like Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith and Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand and, different things. I had always been sort of familiar with talk radio and cable news because my dad listened to a lot of that and absorbed a lot of that, but I took the time to really sort of go deep into it. Sort of in various different ways exposed myself, and again, just naturally being around soldiers for the first time in my life, being around military people and people of a more conservative religious disposition, I wound up getting to a point to where in my efforts to understand the thinking on the right, I wound up sort of reevaluating my own perspectives and views on a wide range of things, and came to the conclusion that on many things, on most things even, on a generic left-right spectrum, I fall a little bit right of center. I was never in love with the label conservative or Republican, maybe because I feel like I've always been a little bit sensitive to the limitations of labels in general. Nevertheless, I came to believe, one thing I never abandoned was my belief that ultimately what we need to do in order to, I think, put society on a more sustainable track, from everything from the policy level and structural level on down to the foundational sort of level of our social fabric, is to enable people to sort of empathize across these ideological and cultural divides, to sort of reconnect on the basis of what shared values may still exist between us. And so there was sort of a two-pronged concern that prompted me to both run for Congress and run for Congress specifically as a Republican when we moved back to Los Angeles and moved back to South LA. In general, my objective was to run a campaign that would help people see that there's both humanity, that there's both moral value and intellectual value to be found on both sides of the left-right partition. That was my general objective. And my specific objective was to articulate a vision of America and a political approach that would be empowering and inspiring to the African American community in particular. Because again, I mean, South LA, it's African American and it is Latino, predominantly. It's urban center, right? And I have a particular sensitivity to the conditions here because I think they're the result of a long history of injustices which have left us in a situation to where one of the many consequences of that history is that we're sort of locked into a political myopia of sorts, where we've sort of accepted the idea that there's one general ideological prism through which we can perceive and act upon the political system, and there is one general political structure which we have to place our faith and our confidence in order to advocate for our interests, and that, of course, is the Democratic Party and the liberal agenda broadly based. Now, there's plenty of nuance within those generalities.
Yes.
But I thought I could do a great deal of good by giving people an alternative view in terms of how we could engage politics, something that was not insensitive to the Black experience, but that nevertheless was not pessimistic in terms of the opportunities that this country could afford us, including the opportunity to be able to engage different players in the political scene who we might have more in common with than we care to realize, i.e., a number of Republicans and plenty of more conservative values and so forth. So it wasn't a partisan campaign. My perspectives have always, on most things, but not all things, my perspectives certainly tend to tilt in a rightward direction. But I mean, frankly, you want to get people to start thinking in terms of, well, what stands alone as a reasonable perspective, apart from the stigma that attaches itself to whatever labels you might associate with a particular idea. If we take a certain idea out of the ideological or partisan container, such that we forgot that it ever came out of a certain container, does it make sense or does it not? And so I tried to discuss ideas like that in as neutral terms as possible when I was.
Could you give an example?
Yeah. So, the issue of school choice, for instance, I don't run across too many folks in the Black community. There are certainly some who, just on principle, are opposed to the idea that parents should be able to decide where they send their children to school. Yet we're locked in a situation where people are generally limited to the options available in their zip code because you're assigned, you're given latitude to attend a certain school on the basis of where you live geographically. And that dramatically, of course, limits the educational opportunities available to people within a certain zone. Well, if you just describe that situation to people in neutral terms and you say, okay, we can have a situation where you have to send your children to the school in your particular zip code, regardless of how well or how poorly it is functioning, or we can have a situation to where you can compare and contrast your different educational options, and on the basis of what works best for you, you can allow your children to you have the freedom to send your kids to the educational establishment that's actually going to be most beneficial to them. Mm-hmm. What sort of situation would you prefer? Well, it's pretty overwhelming in my experience that people like the latter option, and that the resistance to it tends to come from the fact that it's an idea that's associated with a larger right-wing or conservative political perspective or the Republican Party agenda. And by the way, I'm simplifying that issue. Of course, there's plenty more nuance to it than that, and there are intelligent reasons to be a little bit skeptical of just school choice brought, just a sort of laissez-faire approach to school choice. Nevertheless, I think the basic framing of it that I just laid out is essentially accurate, and people were very much open to that discussion of ideas, whereas they would not have been open to the question of, well, this is something Republicans think. Do you want to talk about it and see if it's if it's something you might be interested in? Well, the answer to that question is no right off the bat, because we all know what Republicans are like, right? And they're not people who have the best interests of our people at heart, or at least that's the stigma that comes along with it. So this is why framing is such an important thing to me, and so empathizing with people's experiences. So anyway, I've done way more than answer your questions. Look, if I get long-winded, feel free to.
No, this is excellent. This is excellent. Did you feel resistance in yourself claiming the framework of Republican, or were you worried about the blowback or the optics on that?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I mean, when I initially sort of felt myself undergoing this conversion, you might say. And look, a part of me hates referring to it in that way because I just look at myself as having experienced an evolution in my own thinking, in my own empirical and philosophical understanding of the world and of society. I never fell in love with the Republican tribe per se, just because I'm distrustful of the tribalism in politics generally.
Yeah.
So I frequently would find myself listening to, say, like Sean Hannity, for instance, who I've spent not so much recently, but a lot of time growing up because my dad would watch Fox News and so forth. And then later, you know, I had a lot of driving jobs, so listening to talk radio was a regular thing for me.
Yeah.
You know, I'd hear him say all sorts of things that made me think like, this guy can be obnoxious, and I hate the way he's talking about Obama, and I hate the way he's you know, sort of teasing people and, you know, calling people names, this, that, or the other. But I would still try and dig beneath that to say, okay, but what is he saying about the 1980s? What is he saying about the growth of the American economy under Ronald Reagan? What is he saying about, you know, about the problem of dependency and you know, the self-serving expansion of the welfare state and so on and so forth? And, you know, I would try and steelman his and other conservative pundits' arguments to myself, and then look for the best intellectual arguments undergirding them. And, you know, intellectually, I was comfortable with seeing value in that simply because I honestly did. Now, in terms of putting the hat on, the Republican hat, I knew that a lot of people wouldn't get that at first. I think that I thought that, you know, the people who know me in my life know my values. They know that I'm a person who genuinely cares about humanity and human dignity and equality and freedom for all people. And clearly, you know, nobody who knows me well would think that I was ever coming from a place of prejudice. And, you know, being a person who was interested in being something of a bridge within the political universe between these different groups of people, I thought, you know, I've got a well thought out reason for putting on this hat. One, I find myself agreeing with Republicans on a lot of material things. And two, I think that being a young, you know, millennial person of color advocating from sort of an experiential posture that allows me to sort of articulate what's going on in the minds and hearts of the demographic groups that fall outside of the Republican tent, such that I might be able to create a conversation between these two sides. I thought that people, I guess I thought that people who knew me would recognize the fact that my moral compass hadn't shifted. I had just developed a wider appreciation of what actually made sense. And, you know, by and large, I think that's true, although it hasn't been universally true. The thing that I didn't stop to appreciate was the fact that if I were to jump into politics as a candidate, most people weren't going to know me. You know? And so, you know, I'd have to deal with the fact that to other people who didn't know me, I am nothing but my label until they get to know me.
Yeah.
But of course, that was another reason for me not to go around waving that flag all the time. And, you know, I neither advertised it nor hid it, because in my mind, the important thing was always just to spark this earnest, objective conversation, this earnest conversation over what the objective truth is in the area of, you know, politics, culture, society, etc. And, you know, the fact that I'm a Republican becomes relevant in that conversation at certain points.
Yeah, yeah.
But, you know, that was always the idea, though, to adopt a label in an effort to show people the limitations of those labels, in a sense, right?
Yeah.
And so I knew that there would be a bit of a social price to be paid for it. I think I was about as well prepared for that as I could have been, but I was still, you know, taken by surprise at various points.
Oh, really?
In that campaign, and since then, by the hostility that I get from some people here and there who seem like they're really nice and sweet, and then they find out my dirty secret.
Yeah.
I'll wind up getting whipped for it in one way or another.
And have you developed ways of like spidey senses to detect when that's coming, and methods of kind of judoing it around into more productive conversation?
Yeah. I should say that I probably always had those senses somewhat well developed, I think, probably just from other circumstances of my upbringing. So interesting thing. This will tie back into your question here, but my dad became a Republican officially right around the time that I did, and just for very different reasons. Although there's some overlap, but my dad. So I mentioned the Wood family is Democratic family going back, and my grandfather was Kennedy Democrat, knew Kennedy well, was very close to the Gore family and so forth. Was also good friends with Richard Nixon and folks on both sides. But he was. But at the end of the day, he was a Democrat. But my grandfather and my father, wound up looking at themselves as being that type of Democrat that the Democratic Party left behind. You frequently hear Republicans say that if John Kennedy were alive today, he'd be a Republican.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me. Well, I don't know whether that's true or not exactly, but what I do know is that the Democratic Party and the Democratic Party was was a philosophically diverse party decades ago. I mean, the Dixiecrat Democrats were not the same as your Adlai Stevenson Democrats, were not the same as your John Kennedy Democrats. But even so, my father grew up in a home and in a cultural zone of American life that was not religiously conservative, but that nevertheless had a relationship to traditional religious values. It was a home that was probably not in love with the sort of militaristic side of American politics, the Goldwater sort of rhetoric, or what Eisenhower warned against in the military-industrial complex and so forth. My dad opposed the Vietnam War and so forth, but nevertheless, he also grew up, admiring the legacy of the founding fathers and feeling connected to the to the exploits of the pioneers, Davy Crockett's and Daniel Boone's and so forth. I mean, a love for America and Americana and so forth was very much baked into my father's cultural upbringing, and that has been passed down to me, I will quickly admit. But the Democratic Party wound up becoming a vehicle, I think, for cultural forces that on fundamental levels sort of questioned the something of the integrity or the ethical legitimacy of any kind of patriotic narrative. So in other words, I think you've always had people vying for these different versions of what patriotism looks like in America. Yeah. And on the right, I think it's always been somewhat explicit. On the left, I think that there's always been more room for dissent as part of the arsenal it's just as part of the activity of a patriot. A patriot can also be an activist, right?
Yeah.
On the left, but an activist is still very much a patriot, or at least that was, I think, part of the heart of a more traditional liberal conception. But that, I think, has shifted in the direction of saying, like, to be effectively an opponent of the inequalities of our current society, you have to sort of reject the American ideal. And so that's the general shift that I think happened within the Democratic Party from my father's youth to my father's advancement in age. And specifically, the issue with him was that as a white man who grew up admiring black music and black culture and black people, I mean, quite literally, my dad is first of all, my grandfather's success in music started with the Randy's Record Shop, which was the first radio show to broadcast rhythm and blues and gospel music, black music, to a national audience. He founded Dot Records after that, but the Randy's Record Shop was a huge thing. And keep in mind, again, my grandfather was a white man. My dad is a white man. My dad grew up in recording studios because he'd go to the Dot sessions, and he'd be around all sorts of artists, but a lot of black jazz artists and so forth. Johnny Hodges, guys like that, and he wound up falling in love with Art Blakey and John Coltrane and Miles Davis, and then through boxing and baseball, Muhammad Ali and Willie Mays. My dad's three greatest heroes in life were Muhammad Ali, Willie Mays, and Bill Evans, who was a white jazz pianist who first came to prominence playing with John Coltrane and Miles Davis, and went on to be one of the very great players of all time. So my dad loves black people and black culture like it's just wrapped up in his own self-identity as an American. Yeah. To him, America is every bit as much Duke Ellington as it was George Washington, right? But but they all exist, Duke Ellington, Andy Williams, Pat Boone, they all exist within the same pantheon. And yet as time went on, people like Elvis Presley, who, like my father, grew up admiring and being influenced by the black cultural tradition and music and so forth, wound up being accused of being racist for having appropriated this culture and this music and so forth. Pat Boone has been received criticism for that because most of Pat's hits weren't so obviously rock and rhythm and blues inspired as Elvis's were, but his first hits were. Pat Boone's first big hits were covers of Tutti Frutti by Little Richard, and of Ain't That a Shame or Ain't It a Shame by Fats Domino, and people accuse Pat Boone of ripping off black artists by covering those songs and doing so well with them, launching his career with them. Yeah. And it's part of this narrative that says that, America has just been racist, not just on the structural, the sort of official structural levels, but just on a cultural level. Black man records a song, white people aren't necessarily buying it or listening to it, or they're not broadcasting, they're not promoting it and so forth. He's got to struggle to get by, but white man comes along and records that same song, steals it from black artists, and now he's a multimillionaire. And so there's this narrative of the injustice of our history and so forth that resolves itself in that court as well. Now, anybody who criticizes Pat Boone for that is really criticizing my grandfather, because it was my grandfather who told Pat to record those songs.
Oh, really? Huh.
Yeah, of course, because coming from the Randy's record shop, Grandpa fell in love with and discovered the beauty of black music early on. That's how he made his career initially, right? So he was the one who showed Pat those songs and so forth. Now, what people don't realize is that covering other artists' music, that was just a regular thing. Frank Sinatra would do the same song that Nat King Cole did, that Andy Williams did, that Bing Crosby did. That's the way music worked in those times. You would have standard songs that were written by people other than the folks who were singing them for the most part. But whether they were or weren't, if one person had a hit, everybody else did it, right? Because that's just the way it worked. If it was
a culture of Williams, sharing.
It could be a good song for Johnny Mathis, right?
Yeah.
The fact that Little Richard and Fats Domino didn't get the type of exposure for their music that Pat Boone did, I think is a reflection, to some degree, of the prejudice of the times, as well as potentially a reflection of taste. But obviously the prejudice of the times had a lot to do with that, right? Yeah. But certainly, Pat Boone was not an agent of the prejudice of the times by covering those songs. Quite to the contrary, in covering those songs, he wound up bringing Little Richard and Fats Domino to greater prominence than they'd ever been before. And that wasn't necessarily the point of his covering the songs either. The point is just that, he treated that music, and my grandfather treated that music the same way they treat music coming from anybody, which is to say that if it was good, you did it. You sang it, you covered it, right? And it's important to note that Fats Domino made a lot of money because he got paid for those songs that were covered by Pat Boone. Fats Domino called my grandfather on Grandpa's, I think, 85th birthday or something like that. Grandpa's since passed, but this was about maybe 15 or 20 years ago. And sang him happy birthday. And he wouldn't have done that if he'd have thought my grandfather ripped him off. Little Richard was friends with my dad for years. So this wasn't necessarily a narrative that was baked in the cake in the 50, 40, 30 years ago, right? But over time it evolved. And I think my dad just came around to being sensitive to this to what seemed to be this budding story, which said that all things in America that were traditionally American and that were certainly, they're traditionally American or had to do with older white men, older white successful capitalist men, perhaps in particular, are necessarily racist and oppressive and so forth.
Yeah.
And so Dad, I think, sort of got drawn into the gravity of the counter-conservative narrative, which was always emphasizing the fact that the left had basically become hostile to America and sort of racist on some level, or at least hostile to white people or to white men and so forth. And it's not that my dad thought that everybody on the left was anti-white, but I think that he did feel that there was this effort, this social agenda to recast everything traditionally American as racist, including the very anti-racist sort of intersection of popular culture that allowed for Muhammad Ali and Charlton Heston to be friends, and Ali and Elvis to be friends for that matter, and that allowed for the great jazz musicians to exist alongside, for there to be white artists and black artists working alongside of each other at the apex of American cultural acclaim. I mean, that was my father's universe growing up, and what about that could be racist? And so when the script flipped, I think his political sympathies flipped along with it, and he's not the only erstwhile white Democrat of his generation to feel that way, So my conversion was different, and I never developed an animus to progressives or Barack Obama or liberals per se. I still have a lot of sympathy with things I hear said on the left, but so that was my father's conversion story. And so to take it all the way back around, I remember my father having conversations with people about the glory of American music going back in time, right? And my dad has always been very anti-hip-hop, which is ironic because on my mother's side, one of my uncles is Mac 10 of the West Side Connection, who I don't know if you're familiar with
I do not know.
With that name. Well, NWA. NWA was Ice Cube's group. When Ice Cube left NWA, he started his own group, which was called the West Side Connection, and Mac 10 was one of the three guys in that group. It was Ice Cube, Dub C, and Mac 10, right? So gangster rap and all that, my dad just didn't have any time for any of that thing. So my dad was always evangelizing on behalf of jazz when I was growing up, and about just traditional American culture in general, which he viewed as, again, being Sam Cooke, Duke Ellington, Miles Davis, Johnny Coltrane, in addition to Pat Boone and Bing Crosby, etc. And so I could always tell when somebody was about to, get sort of defensive about Dad seeming to criticize hip hop and so forth, right? So when I was a candidate for Congress, and if I was going to talk about something like the importance of the free market, or the importance of school choice, like I mentioned, or the limitations of the federal government, you start to traipse upon certain phrases or words that are going to have the potential of triggering an emotionally charged ideological response and so forth. And I think my way of diffusing that, which was never really a part of my dad's toolkit. If you got mad at my dad for talking bad about gangster rap, he didn't care, right? But he was very charismatic. He's very charismatic and so forth. So he'd be good at making people laugh and so forth. And he deals with opposition well. But my thing was always to say that I'm about to criticize the federal government here, right? I'm about to criticize the government's role in our lives. But I'm not saying that the government doesn't have a legitimate place in our society. It's easy to go too far in criticizing the role of the government and so forth. And, if you're a person, as many people in my community are, who at one time or another found him or herself benefiting from the presence of food stamps or supplemental nutritional assistance programs or Medicaid or what have you. Yeah. I mean, clearly, these are examples of these programs doing some good in your experience and for yourself and for your community and your family potentially. That is a legitimate piece of data for you to be concerned with in the context of me saying anything at all about the federal government needing potentially to back up a little bit in terms of its relationship with us. And so I would try and acknowledge that experience. And that's just one potential example. For any issue, I can give you other ways of approaching it. So I would be upfront about my recognizing the fact that you likely have some experience that gives you a pretty darn good reason for wanting to defend the issue that I think you're likely to want to defend here in a second. But let me show you another side of the coin, though, and show you how your aspiration to be not just secure in as much as there is an economic floor underneath you or a structural floor beneath you that might keep you or others like you from just slipping into poverty at the malicious whims of a capricious, free market or what have you. But that not only could there be a situation that secures us on the bottom end, but there could also be a situation that just by drawing back on the excesses of the state allows us to open up more opportunity as we ride the escalator upwards hopefully into social mobility and prosperity, right? And so I frame things in such a way as to where I make it clear I understand your experience, right? Or at least I have some insight into it. And I'm not attacking that, right? And I'm not attacking the legitimacy of certain things that you've been through, which have given you certain specific conclusions about the way things ought to be. I'm acknowledging the validity of that. I'm acknowledging the fact that there's likely to be some grains of truth in the conclusions you've drawn from your experiences. But you have other ambitions, you have other hopes and aspirations and so forth, which might be well served by another way of looking at this. And in order for us to be able to realize those other aspirations and ambitions you have, those other values you'd like to see fulfilled, let's work together. Let's collaborate on articulating a different point of view.
That strongly echoes Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind, where he talks about a constellation of values, and that conservatives tend to have a few more values than typically the liberals do, at least in his book and with his data.
Yeah, well, no, that's absolutely correct, and the basic idea undergirding Haidt's work, this idea that we are led, in essence, by our emotions, and that our reason sort of serves to justify the conclusions of our emotions and our feelings. That was a conclusion I came to early on in studying philosophy and so forth, and even prior to philosophy, that basic dynamic of human nature was clear to me, I think, in music. Because I grew up playing jazz. Yeah, I grew up playing jazz too, and I play the trumpet. I mean, I'm a bit rusty now, but if you hand me a horn, I can still do something with it for a minute or two. And the thing about music and improvisation in particular, which is not limited to jazz or even music in general by any means, is that to do it well, you have to ultimately give yourself over to the fluidity of your intuitions, I suppose. You have to sort of be taken hold of by the currents of feeling, and yet you can't just pick up an instrument and improvise well without having a thoroughgoing understanding of the mechanism that is the instrument, of the ways in which it is functionally operated. You have to study, certainly to be able to operate an instrument. You have to know how to blow it. You've got to know how to manipulate the keys. You've got to know how to control your body in conjunction with the operations of the instrument. And then in order to understand music, you need to have a sense of musical structure. You need to have a sense of the way chords work as sort of the backdrop of linear notation and so forth. There's all sorts of data points which you need to sort of intellectually absorb in order to be able to participate in that process and to improvise, well. But once you've absorbed that information, it then becomes a kinetic process. I mean, once you've absorbed that information on a theoretical level, then up to your sensitivity to allow you to sort of embody it in terms of actually expressing it through the vehicle of a performance. Yeah. And in politics, I've always taken the exact same approach. I mean, I as a candidate, well, actually, it was pretty difficult to find time to study the issues as much as I would have wanted to as a candidate. That's one of the ironies of running for office, and one of the problems with our current system. People spend so much time raising money and speaking to groups that they lose out on actually having time to be continually educated. But leading up to my candidacy, I ran for office, and my campaign really started in early 2013. Obama was elected in late 2008. So for that, for that 4+ year period in between, I mean, I was studying politics and also philosophy and theology and science and all these other things that I thought might be tangentially related. I spent a long time giving myself an education and absorbing information. But when I actually got out there and ran, it was a matter of human connection. Yeah. I've got the facts, but now let me make the human connection so that the facts can be delivered in an efficacious way and so forth. So I never operated under what I considered to be more or less the illusion that people were going to respond the way I would like them to respond to rational arguments. And I think that even the people who do respond the way you like them to rational arguments are people who have sort of an emotional alignment which corresponds to the possession of a set of values that allows them to derive emotional satisfaction from the pursuit of objective truth. And I think that that's a very desirable thing. And in fact, in your conversation with Coleman Hughes, he basically says that straight out. You ask him a question about, you said something to him along the lines of, was there some trepidation, or did you feel, like the question you asked me previously here, you asked him if there wasn't some emotional dislocation that took place as he found himself drifting away or stepping away from the progressive worldview, the progressive racial worldview in particular. And he said that something along the lines of, he didn't so much think that was the case for him because he's always seen, I guess, considered it unhealthy for people's sense of identity to be attached too closely to what they believe. I'm paraphrasing him, of course, but basically making the case that he always felt that it was healthy to treat beliefs independently of that. And what that shows me is that, he derives a certain, and I'm not trying to go out on a limb by psychoanalyzing anybody, but my feeling about that is that his sense of identity is tied to himself as a person who values the objective truth. Yeah. And again, that is a wholly admirable thing. But I don't think that takes us outside of the emotional framework or the sort of, the intuitive framework. And that's the observation that I think undergirds all of Haidt's subsequent analysis in The Righteous Mind and so forth. And understanding that allows us to realize that the entire practice of effective communication is, in a sense, the practice of seeking to make connection on an emotional or a feelings-based or intuitive level. And, again, the relationship to values therein is tightly correlated. But the art of communication has to be understood in that way. And insofar as I understood that and was able to apply that understanding, I think I was able to penetrate, and I hate to even use the word penetrate because it makes it seem like I'm coming at it from the outside, which as a Republican, in that sense I was, but it allowed me to dive deep into the sort of social and cultural environment of the very left-wing urban culture of South Central Los Angeles, and
make connections with those people.
Yeah, precisely. But I do think that principle can be effective pretty much anywhere you go, controlling for a million different variables, of course. But I do think the basic wisdom there is sound, in my own experience.
Yeah, absolutely. You brought up earlier that when Barack Obama got elected, you had a feeling of idealism about us as in the U.S. moving towards a post-racial, post-partisan era. And I felt that way too. And yet I witnessed the way that Barack Obama was treated by the Congress, and then I see it happening in a lot of different other arenas, is that good intentions and earnestness, and not even good intentions, but good faith can be steamrolled by bad faith, and nuance can be steamrolled by passion. And what I almost want to say, and this is just speculating, that the left has taken so much abuse from the right, and I'm talking about like Fox News right and Rush Limbaugh right, just like harping on them, that they finally kind of snapped, and now we have Antifa. Now we have like this very extreme kind of pushback that's no compromise in and of itself, just as much as there was no compromise in the attack of that. I wonder if that rings true for you, or what you think about the loss of idealism and the frailty of good faith.
Well, I think I have a lot of thoughts about the subject of good faith in general, as to the particular formulation that you've articulated, which I think I hear you as saying that folks on the right have been hostile to compromise for a long time, and now that has infected the way people act on the left. And in fact, I think I saw Jonathan Rauch retweet an article, which I didn't get around to reading, but it seemed to be making the same point, and Rauch seemed to agree with it. And of course, Rauch is more conservative leaning overall. But it's a chicken and the egg thing for me in terms of who's to blame, because you talk to people on either side of the cultural divide, they're always able to point to the other side having done something that provoked them to do something that they otherwise wouldn't have done in a hostile direction or a negative direction. And that's always how we justify the excesses of our actions. So I'd have to think about that a little bit to think.
Maybe I framed it wrong by using the left and the right as an example, but I just, one of the things that I'm concerned with is kind of basically the same principles that your Better Angels group is, where you're trying to create a arena or a floor of discourse where disagreement can occur in a productive manner. And one of the things that I'm worried about, or one of the problems that I see arising, is that the loudest voices come in, or even I see on Twitter like these waves of aggression just rolling through Twitter, and just drowning out any actual human connection. And I wonder how do we avoid that, and how do we protect against that?
No, I recognize your core concern there, and that's basically the daily activity of anybody who wants to create space for a more productive and earnest and harmonious sort of conversation to unfold. It's the fact that you're always going to have people wading into that space, or trying to wade into that conversation, or attacking it from the outside from various angles, who feel that the only way for us to make progress is to fight, or maybe they're not even really committed to progress at the end of the day. Maybe all they're really committed to is defeating the people they dislike, and if you are trying to make peace between them and the people they dislike, well, now they dislike you. And so, that is the constant struggle. But for me, this is where the power of love as a social value comes in. And I adopt Martin Luther King Jr.'s understanding of what that phrase means in this conflict. King said at various points, he said, love is not mere sentimentality. It is not emotional bosh, which is a phrase I've only ever heard him, only familiar with him as having said. I'm sure what I know what bosh means exactly, but I think we get the point, though. Actually, his use of the word love was carried over from the Greek term agape. Yeah. And the Greek term agape, which is also translated as love in the Bible, in the New Testament, means essentially goodwill. It's the type of love that you can have for a person for whom you do not also have any corresponding like or affection, right? Okay. And King put it in those terms. In talking about George Wallace, I think, or maybe Bull Connor, he said, I love this is, and I'm paraphrasing again, but I think he said something along the lines of, "I love Bull Connor, but I would find it very difficult to like him. I couldn't very well like a person who, sinks dogs on women and children marching and demonstrating for freedom." But he loves them in as much as he is a human being, and he is a person who has within him the potential for goodness, even if it's not being realized or actualized in that moment. And what King's whole body of social work was really aimed towards fundamentally was to sort of talk my book, so to speak, was to discover the better angels of our nature and the better angels of the nature of those people who stood in moral opposition to the moral cause of genuine freedom and meaningful equality. He felt that it was both empowering to the person who committed himself to the principles of nonviolence to carry love within him or herself towards those who opposed him or her, as well as more greatly effective in turning the hearts and minds of those who are in the opposition. Because ultimately, hatred has a way of feeding off of itself. I mean, you fight fire with fire, and all that does is ensure that everything burns down all the more quickly.
Yeah.
But if you're water in this scenario, fire will turn you to steam a little bit, but if you just keep coming, eventually that fire gets put out. There's no fuel for it to burn anymore after a certain point. And in conducting himself the way he did, and in the nonviolent wing of the civil rights movement conducting itself the way that it did, I think that it was able to demonstrate to a great many people in America who had previously operated from a standpoint that said that they had some reason, culturally, politically, socially, or otherwise, to hate or dislike or to oppose African Americans in their search for political and social equality and so forth, whatever agenda they associated with that. I think that sustained moral but noble and sort of humble social pressure that was demonstrated in that movement, I think it gave many people who were erstwhile hostile cause to reevaluate themselves and their own sentiments, and to question why they had felt the way they did in terms of feeling hostile to these people in the first place. Now, obviously, racism was not, wholly eradicated in our society. That was not within the power of Dr. King to accomplish, and everything I'm talking about here is more complicated than what I'm able to articulate in this limited space. Nevertheless, I think the core observation I've just made here for you is sound, and because we live in the aftermath of that in our society today. Quite frankly, I believe that you can draw a connection between that sort of self-reflection, which I think was very much positive within, for lack of any better phrase for it, white society, right? I think that you can draw a connection between that healthy self-reflection that led to genuine social progress and political progress during and in the aftermath of the civil rights movement. You can draw a line between that and the excesses of white guilt as they exist today. I think that, and one of the interesting things that Coleman Hughes, one part of his thinking that I think is interesting and very apt is his sort of description of the social economy that exists within the sort of activist sphere, wherein even if you're not, setting yourself up to succeed in the wider professional marketplace, there is nevertheless a hierarchy within the activist community and so forth that you can ascend to the top of by exemplifying, by being perhaps the most intensely or passionately committed to a certain ideology and a certain pattern of behavior in service to that ideology. But amongst the white allies and so forth, I think that the echoes to me that intensity of white guilt and many of its more mild shades, is a reflection of the fact that there really was a deep heartbreak within within the minds of many white people in this country over just a sort of, I imagine in watching the footage of these innocent black people being hosed, being being bitten, and then in coming to absorb the eloquent arguments of King and Baldwin and these other people, I can see this crushing sense of historic shame that a lot of white people realized, and from that, I think, has sprung something of an economy of recompense that many, if not, maybe not most, but that many white people have embraced in saying, okay, let us renew our commitment to social justice and equality, because we have this historic mark of shame upon us that we need to make up for. And I think that there's probably a healthy and constructive part of that spectrum, and then I think that there's an excess on that spectrum, and I think the excess bleeds into a lot of what we see in the social justice activism that's most visibly chronicled in these sorts of, in the volatile demonstrations we see on campus. And
I wonder if it doesn't
white people who are a part of it. But
I wonder if that shame doesn't find, or that economy of shame is coupled by an economy of resentment in the black community too. I see that on Twitter. There's a lot of resentment and a lot of shame coming from these two groups, and they kind of feed off of each other and use that as a cycle.
I remember.
And if you decide not to participate in that, then you're screwed, or stand up against that.
Well, I mean, particularly if you're in a social setting where that's the way everybody else is to one degree or another. Yeah. I remember I was on a podcast with some friends of mine on a podcast called Black Is, which is a great site and a great platform. And I remember, so we're all black on the podcast, and I remember a friend of mine saying something like, "I'm all for white guilt." Man, he was like, "I love it. I support it 100%." And I can understand the practicality in that, because one, there is a basis, and now I speak as a person who is also, half white and who does feel, I think, a lineage and cultural connection to the white experience in America, and obviously in a somewhat, different kind of context, but it's there with me, But I can see obviously how there's a functionality in saying, well, the more guilty white people feel about this history of oppression, the more they'll try and make good for the real and historic, abuses and so sad to have to use the word so broadly, but that they have perpetrated historically and arguably still perpetrate through the operations of various institutions and what have you, And so I can only, now he was saying it's sort of tongue in cheek, but he was at least half serious, and very smart and reasonable guy. But I can imagine going on just a few steps, I guess to the left of him, if we're going to put it on the right-left axis. I can imagine you wouldn't have to go too many steps leftward from where he's at to somebody who says that, okay, let's develop this kind of sadomasochistic relationship with certain white allies who are willing to kind of come into our tent in sort of a self-abusing effort to reform for past injustices, and let's allow them to come in as long as they're willing to start and more or less stay perhaps at the bottom of the hierarchical structure, or maybe let's just make it to where their path towards upwards mobility in this structure is predicated on their utter rejection of, I guess, various aspects of their own heritage or legacy, such as we perceive them. And again, this is just a generic illustration I'm offering.
What's your resistance to that? in your own life, your resistance, and not just in America race relations, but your relationship with resentment and shame, and how have you structured yourself to recognize those and to deal with those movements in your heart?
Right. I think I may have missed the beginning of your question, but you're asking me how I have dealt with my own relationship to the legacy of shame and so forth.
Well,
and
whether or not, like, within we can make it, we can stay on the specific topic of race relations in America, but I think the topic of resentment and shame are two they're very attractive motivations. Talking about elephants, they're elephants that are pretty sweaty, and they can get you pretty far in certain directions and stuff. So, do you have a relationship with that, and how do you classify that and work against that in yourself, or where does resentment and shame fit on your bookshelf?
Well, now that's interesting. I think that my instinct is to say that I need to take them separately, really quick, because I do think that there's a relationship and a perverse relationship between resentment and shame, and certainly in the social dynamic we were just discussing. Mm-hmm. But in my life, I'm not sure that they connect too much, although maybe something will reveal itself to me here. With respect to shame, though, I grew up, I think, in something of the anti-shame, zeitgeist. I mean, I'm kind of a product of the self-esteem movement and so forth, and it's interesting, and it's very much a blessing for me in my life. I have never, in my upbringing, all in all, I have never had serious cause to feel ashamed of being either white or black. I never felt that either of those hemispheres of my identity, let's say, were really, at the end of the day, causes for me to feel bad about myself. If anything, I felt good about it because I saw goodness and a richness, I suppose, in the cultural and historical legacies and experiences of both sides of that, particularly in the context of my own nuclear family, and then going broadly outward to that, in the ability it gave me to sort of, I guess, see myself in the historical cultural narratives of both Africans and Europeans and so forth in America, broadly speaking. And then, I wound up, so I grew up in a more progressive sort of enclave, which, by the way, I mean, just being a mixed kid kind of gave me a sort of a social privilege in that, I mean, I can definitely recall people calling me an Oreo or a donkey maybe, or this, that, or the other. I mean, yeah, I can remember black kids making me feel bad for not being black enough because I was half white, and I can remember some, I can remember, I don't ever remember anybody making me feel bad or for being black, but I certainly could see on the faces of other black kids in my family and in my school, because most of the black kids who went to Culver City, went to the Culver City School District, were bussed in from South LA, from the type of places where I live now. Right, but I grew up in Culver City. I was more of a middle class suburban kid, right? So it was a different dynamic, and I could see that there was a historical sense of I could see that there was a sense of sadness over the black condition that other black kids had, that I had too, but that I sort of took on by virtue of osmosis and sympathy with their experience and their perspectives and so forth, as opposed to that being a direct result of any sense of oppression that I felt in my own life, right? Okay. Yeah. So I in that sense, shame within the context of the black experience for sort of being black, that sort of psychological self-hatred that a lot of black people have to some degree, I recognized it and I saw it early on, and it hurt me because I could just see how painful it was to carry it around. But I can't say that I ever had it, right? And I think that, again, that's something for me to be thankful for. That's not something for me to regret. And then as I got older, I got into the whole, I got into New Age spirituality at a certain point, and on a religious level, that there's a substantial part of that, pardon me, that sort of grows out of the self-esteem ethos, right? The idea being that God loves you just the way you are. You're already perfect, and life is not about becoming more perfect morally. I've got a real stubborn gnat here. I don't know where
I see it.
It doesn't want to go away.
It's only taking up 3 pixels, though, so...
Okay, well, that's maybe we can edit them out when we...
Yeah, totally, yeah. I'll send it down to my CGI company after we're done here.
There you go, right. Yeah, so, I mean, the New Age spiritual movement sort of grows out of the self-esteem ethos in some sense. The idea being that God loves you just as you are and so forth, and the point of life isn't so much to become more fully... isn't so much to shed your sin and shame, but rather to embrace your greater perfection, right? And there may be some sense in which you can argue that there's some semantic overlay there, but the psychological implications of those two different framings were pretty substantial. The difference between the two.
The New Age movement,
right,
and
between the frame that says that I am perfect as I am, and I just need to more fully express my perfection, which is more of the New Age framing, and as opposed to the more traditional religious framing. Take the Catholic example, for instance, which says that we need to repent for our sins, and we need to we need to wholly accept our innate guilt,
fallenness,
right? Right, exactly, for original sin and so forth, and that bleeds out into all sorts of non-religious ways of looking at things as well. So in coming to Christianity, actually part of what I liked about it about part of the value I saw in the kind of Christian moral structure was, in fact, in recognizing the fact that, hey, I do have flaws and deficiencies in my character, and it would be good to repent for these. It would be good to atone for these. Because one conclusion I came to somewhere along the road was that true eudaimonia, let's say, true fulfillment in life, I think is really only available to you as you maximize the sort of virtue content of your character, because that's the only thing that will allow for, I think, a real enduring type of happiness to flower from the root of one's conscience, if you will. I think that's the ultimate sort of enlightenment or salvation or self-realization. It's coming to the point in life where on the deepest moral level, you can look inwardly at your heart and your conscience and say that I am clean. And of course, that would require for you to think, I think, in a way that optimizes your sense of care and concern for people around you, but it also requires you to act selflessly in that way. And I think that there is something of an economic structure in terms of the fabric of our social and emotional relationships with each other, wherein currency is, wherein the unit of currency is sort of the it's our capacity to elevate the quality of one another's experience. And actually, I think I heard Sam Harris define morality and ethics in just that way recently, which is that morality and ethics are the ways in which we think about how we impact the experience of one another, right? And so, money has its value, but people pay, much of what people pay money for is just, that which makes them feel good. And if you and I are good friends, and if we build up one another's sense of self and so forth, but we also correct one another where we go wrong, and we instruct one another in terms of how we can be better people, and similarly sort of pay forward this kind of moral activity and so forth. Well, there is an ethical investment that we're making. There's an ethical investment that we're making in one another, which which expresses itself in an emotional, I think, satisfaction, both for our interpersonal bond and within ourselves in relationship to our own conscience, which motivates us to continue to be better and better people. But you reach a ceiling in that process pretty quickly if you're always making excuses for the things that are wrong with you. And so I think that goes a long way towards explaining the appeal of Jordan Peterson, for instance, because Jordan Peterson has articulated a sort of a path for people to achieve their best selves, not by consistently trying to ignore what's wrong with themselves, but by embracing those things and just embracing the process of experiencing the pain of allowing those things to die, you know? And I mean, that, you know, you find the archetypal relationship of that process. I mean, you can see that expressed in Christ dying on the cross. You see it expressed in indisputable historical events through things like Dr. King's, say, assassination, or the sufferings that people endured in the process of advocating for equality and freedom in the United States. Christopher Hitchens talked about the nonviolent movement, and he talked about the leadership and, well, just the African American community in the context of those who were prosecuting the nonviolent agenda as the moral tutors of America. He said that they were the moral tutors of America for a time, and I think that many people felt like that about Dr. King in his own time and afterwards, you know. But in order for him to set that moral example, and his followers to set that moral example, they had to rise above their own hatred of the opposition. They literally had to look at their own hatred of the opposition as being a character flaw, as being a character vice. They had to shed it. They had to repent for it, you know? And clearly that's not something that Malcolm X was fitting to do, although Malcolm X went on his own, journey of philosophical evolution, which saw him adopting a more charitable spirit towards white people before he died and so forth. Bit of another topic. But that wasn't really something that Malcolm and the Nation of Islam were valuing. That wasn't something the Black Panthers were valuing. It wasn't something that most people in America, white, black, left, right, or center, tend to value. And yet I feel like the people who, both historically and certainly within American history, the people who grab a hold of that ethic and say, look, let us adopt the two-pronged strategy of moral and character development, if you will. Let us repent and proactively acknowledge the flaws within our own souls. Let us allow for those flaws to die. Let us replace them with the selfless care and concern for people beyond ourselves, including those people who are our most vicious and vitriolic enemies. And let's replace what beforehand was the easily justifiable tendency to feel a burning oppositional hatred towards those who stand against us, and let's replace this with an overflowing sense of agape love that actually carries with it the power to transform the hearts of our enemies and the capacity to make us feel completely, to allow us to experience the righteous fulfillment that comes with the cleansing of one's own conscience, right? And so that is a powerful process. And that's what appeals to me in the work of Better Angels and the cause of depolarization here today, because, it's not about, just simple civility. I mean, that's, civility is a great thing, but it's sort of a superficial reflection of the health of deeper moral values in society. And
thanks for saying that. That's a good way of looking at that term.
Precisely right. And so, in my own idealism and in my own work in politics and so forth, in my time, I mean, it's a different set of, the pieces are arranged differently on the chessboard, but the fundamental elements are all the same. This moral understanding that I have, I feel, is one that would serve folks way out on the left and way out on the right, because ultimately, even if at any given time you can point to one side or the other and say that they're doing worse than the other is at that moment, it just doesn't change the fact that if the answer to the other person's viciousness is for you to be either a little more or a little less vicious in kind. Well, again, it's just that fire versus fire perpetuation of social and civic destruction, I think. And that's the cycle that needs to be broken. And it's only in breaking that cycle that I think that we can nourish the soil for a more enduring social setup over time.
Yeah.
You know. Yeah. And so to me, that is the battle of battles, and that's the fight I'm fighting today.
Yeah, and I really appreciate. I asked you a question a while ago. I can't really remember the question, but it was about like the frailty of good faith or acting in good faith, and you said that's the work that we have to do every day. That's the constant battle, and then you redirected it back to our own individual need to look at evaluate our own faults and lift them up.
Yeah. I mean, that is sort of the answer to the question, because if you give yourself permission to think that you are only going to seek to understand your opponent so long as they're not too bad, then ultimately you intercept your own ability or you limit your own capacity to actually change the hearts and minds of people who might otherwise be reached with a little extra effort and a little extra patience. Yeah. But it's not easy, though. It's not easy for anybody. Yeah. And, sometimes in life, the only practical option is to fight, and even to fight physically. I mean, we're not all Dr. King. I'm not, and
he probably wasn't either for the most part.
He probably wasn't either, for 12 or 13 hours out of the day. I mean, just to be your best self, almost, I think, by definition, requires more of yourself than you're able to give most of the time. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't really matter, because the goal is still to always be making progress in that direction, Mm-hmm. So I'm not going to say that I'm never going to slip up and insult somebody or say something insensitive or, sock someone in the face, although hopefully I can manage not to do that. But, it's not impossible. It's happened before, man. It's happened before.
Well, we can get into that at a later talk.
But the goal is clear, though. So
yeah, absolutely. I feel we should probably wrap up. It's been an hour, well, more than an hour, but thanks for letting me reach out to you and coming on my channel. I was deeply touched by your ethos and your delivery too. A couple of moments I just saw you kind of be filled with something extra and in what you were talking about, what you're grappling with. I really appreciate when somebody can. There's that talk about like regurgitating talking points, and maybe everything you said could be used as a talking point, but I felt like you were really engaging with your principles, like in live time. It felt like a performance, like a jazz performance, and not a hypocritical performance. So,
well, I take that as a profound compliment, and I appreciate you very much for giving me the opportunity to have this conversation. I mean, honestly, it's part of what I imagine gives you and I both hope, as well as folks who will be watching this interview, is the fact that for all of the downsides that have presented themselves with social media and, ways in which information technology has polarized us, it's also given us a space to go to much greater depth with each other in terms of our mutual pursuit of both empirical and ethical truth, right? And in as much as it has opened a space for these types of conversations to take place, these sorts of dialogues may be the beginning of the answer to the problems that seem so intractable now. And so I'm really grateful to you for being one of the people who's out there opening up these conversations, and I'm very grateful for the chance to be a part of it.
Yeah, we can reach past hope and strike upon nourishment within the correct atmosphere of trust and stuff. So Is there anything else you want to plug? Better Angels? Are you guys you're developing some stuff, and I wonder when is it going to come out? Are you're looking for a studio to do podcasts in, and you have a fledgling YouTube channel and.
Yeah, indeed. So there are different layers to Better Angels, and I would encourage everybody to learn more about Better Angels by visiting better-angels.org, and maybe we can throw a link up or something.
Yeah, I'll
and
do
you
that.
can find and you can find me on Twitter at John R. Wood Jr. Better Angels is an organization that's confronting the issue of polarization head on. We're best known for holding workshops across the country where we take small groups of people who vote Democrat or vote Republican or who lean a little left or a little right or very left and very right. We bring them into a shared space where each person has the opportunity not to debate or argue politics really, but to speak from the vantage point of their own lived experience, let's say. Some people hate when I use the term lived experience, but I understand all experience is lived, but the lived part is a point of emphasis. It's not a point of distinction, right?
Yeah,
so people don't get that. But anyway, folks are given the opportunity to all speak from their vantage point of their own lived experience, with the result typically being that people don't always come around to agreeing on on gun control necessarily, but they're able to see in each other in each other the substance of humanity that they themselves share. And so people frequently come out of these workshops as friends and even collaborating on various issues. So through these workshops, we're seeking to build this culture of depolarization up across the country. We also have other activities that we execute and promote along similar lines. And the Better Angels Media Network is meant ultimately to model this type of dialogue in the digital sphere, and as it evolves, to sort of critique and analyze our broader media political culture through a more ethical lens, one that is willing to call out the BS, but not along tribal lines, but rather that brings together folks on the left and the right who are in opposition to each other, maybe in terms of policy, but who are in agreement in terms of first principles, terms of ethical bedrock, you might say. And so that's the ambition, and I encourage everybody to check it out. Again, that's better-angels.org, and hit me up on Twitter if you want to know more, of course.
It sounds like diversity workshops for the ideologically diverse.
Kind of.
It sounds like a little bit.
I never heard it put that way, but that's probably not too far off.
Well, thanks a lot, John, for joining me.
Yeah, absolutely, brother. It's really been a pleasure. Thank you, Benjamin.